Let's start by talking about the most important of these measures, which is to greatly increase the amount of income you have to bring in a migrant husband or spouse or children. If you're an immigrant into this country and you want to bring in relatives, explain to us how the new system's going to work.
Yes, well, perhaps I could set it, first of all, in the context of the wider issue about net migration. As you say, we want to reduce net migration to the tens of thousands, and we've said in doing that that we would look at every aspect of immigration. So we've already looked at non-EU economic migrants, we've already looked at student visas and settlement, and now we're looking at family. And this is not just about the numbers, though, in terms of family, because we think it is right that somebody who is wanting to bring somebody into the UK to join them as a spouse or a partner should be able to support them financially and should not be bringing them in on the basis that they're going to be reliant on the state.
So
and
how much money do you need to have if you want to bring a wife or a husband in?
Well, what we're talking about is 18,600. We asked our independent migration advisory committee to look at the figures and to advise us as to what that could be. And they set a range, and we've actually chosen at the lower end of the range, but it's the point at which people would normally not be reliant on coming off income-related benefits. And we think that benefits point is an important one.
And what about other relatives? What about children? What about aunts and uncles and grannies and so on?
Well, in relation to children, we think it right that, because obviously there are costs involved in children as well, that the income should be increased, the required income should be increased for each child. So for one child, 22,400 would be the figure, and then £2,400 more for every other child, each additional child. And I think that's right. I think it is important that if people are bringing people into the UK to create a family here in the UK, that we say that you should be able to support yourselves and not be reliant on the state.
And there's a sort of Britishness test that you're going to bring in as well. Tell us about that.
Well, yes, it's about, as I said, it's not just about numbers, it's also about looking at people being able to support themselves here in the UK and that they be able to integrate into UK society, and we think that is important. So for settlement, from next year we will be requiring people to be able to speak English to a certain level, to be able to understand English, and also to do a life in the UK test, so that we know that they're going to be able to integrate and become part of British society here. But of course what we're doing in terms of family migration isn't just about those aspects, it's also about this issue called Article 8.
I want to come on to Article 8, which is the right to a family life in the human rights legislation. But before we do that, you must have seen estimates in your department about what these measures, the ones we've been talking about, will do in terms of net immigration. So how many fewer immigrants do you expect to come into this country as a result of what you're announcing tomorrow?
Well, this is not big numbers, the family migration, which is why, as I've made the point, this isn't just about numbers for family migration. It is about setting out clearly the rules in relation to Article 8, which we can talk about in a little while, but it's also about some pretty important principles, I think, about people being able to support themselves.
I'll come back to numbers.
So it's not in itself about numbers, because the really large numbers, what makes the major difference in terms of the overall net migration is in student visas.
Yes, and there's been lots of issues around that. Well, let's talk about Article 8, which affects people who you want to remove from the country, but you can't remove from the country at the moment, because they are going to court and saying, I have a right to family life, I have married this person, or I have got this child, and therefore whatever I've done as a convicted criminal in this country, you can't get rid of me. That's the essence of the trouble, yes?
The problem is that Article 8 is in the European Convention on Human Rights.
Yes.
And if you look at it in the Convention, there are two parts to it. The first part basically says you have a right to a private and family life. And the second part says that actually states, governments can qualify that right. This is not an absolute right. So in the interests of the economy or of controlling migration or of public order and those sorts of issues, the state has a right to qualify this right to a family life. Now, what's been happening up till now is we've seen cases going through our courts where people who are criminals who we want to deport have been able to stay in the UK because the courts have said, no, you have this right to a family life. And they haven't been qualifying it even, I think, in the way that the European Convention enables them to do.
And so
what I'm going to do is actually set out the rules that say this is what Parliament, this is what the public believe is how you balance the public interest against the individual's interest.
And so you get a parliamentary vote. A lot of eminent lawyers, people like Mr. Bindman and others, say that this is absolutely not the job of MPs or commentators of any kind, that judges make distinctions of this kind. Judges interpret the law, and they will carry on interpreting the law in the way they see fit, no matter what motion goes through Parliament.
Well, and it's also been said by some in the legal profession that actually one of the problems in interpreting it at the moment is that Parliament hasn't been clear enough about what it believes the right to a family life is. Parliament is going to set that out. We're going to ask, we're not just making it as a government statement, we're going to ask Parliament to vote on this, to say very clearly what we think constitutes the right to a family life.
And what happens if judges just carry on as before?
Well, how you balance, what we're going to do is look at how you balance the interests of the public against the interests of the individual. Yeah. And I would expect that judges will look at what Parliament will say and that they will follow and take into account what Parliament has said. If they don't, then we'll have to look at other measures, and that could include primary legislation.
But given that we're signatories to this Act, this international agreement, it's impossible, isn't it, for Parliament to change the effective law when it comes to this area?
But Parliament isn't changing it. What Parliament is doing, what we will ask Parliament to do, is to set out the qualifications which we are entitled to set out under the European Convention itself. And one of the interesting things is, if you look at some of the cases that we've seen, there are some instances where the European court's actually been tougher than our own courts. For example, our own courts tend not to look at whether somebody's been here for a number of years lawfully or illegally, yes. Whereas the European Court actually takes a tougher view on those who've built up so-called rights over a period of time and they've been here illegally. They says, actually, you should pay less attention to that. So what we're doing is taking what is in the Convention itself and saying it's right that we actually apply this in Parliament. Now, as I say, this doesn't get the big numbers. I think it's important to do this on Article 8. In terms of net migration overall, where we are seeing the differences in the student visas, we've seen a significant fall in those.
And that's really coming down. OK, let me ask you, just before we leave this subject, Ken Clarke, Justice Secretary, backs all of this? You've talked to him about it?
Yes, this is a cross-government agreement.
Right, OK. When it comes to overall levels of migration, there's non-EU migration, but a lot of people think as we go through this sort of meltdown in the euro and really intense problems in a lot of these southern European economies, we are going to see a lot of migration, internal migration, coming from Europe. Now, if that happens at a very dramatic level, what, if anything, can you do about it, and what are you planning?
Well, what we're doing is looking at contingency arrangements. So far, we're not seeing any trends in any increased movements, despite obviously there are significant problems already economically in a number of Eurozone countries. But I think it's right that as a government across the board, we look at the contingency arrangements that might be needed.
What could you do if you were worried?
Well, I think this is the whole point of doing the work, is to look to see what it would be possible to do and what it would be appropriate to do in certain circumstances. So I'm not going to make any judgments at this stage. What I think is right is that we look at it properly and consider, but as I say, there are no signs of trends at the moment.